High, dark, wood, sea, festive, forest, sun, moon, fire, desert, snow. No matter what the setting, no matter what the story, no matter what the environment, there seems to always be one constant fantasy. Those goddamn elves. These sharp-eared, sexy bastards are everywhere nowadays. But why is that? Why are we so obsessed with elves, and what's their purpose? Is there even one? And what if, maybe, just maybe, it's actually not a good thing to have these Germanic Norse better than you assholes everywhere? This time, on Why Are We Talking About This? Nerd. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Wait Tad Nerd. I'll be your guide this week through the wild and wacky world of elves. I wrote this week twice. But before all of that, I want to thank you so much for listening and allowing my voice to live rent-free in your brain, even if it's only for a little bit. Also, I will not be moving out voluntarily. You're going to need to get an eviction notice and take me to court. I'm going to stay in your brain until you kick me out. Also, I hope that everything's still working out with every 3 weeks. Hopefully you guys don't mind and continue to spread the show. I also hope listenership starts increasing. That's a whole nother thing. That's just a personal side. But you can help with all of that by first telling your friends and family about the show, forcing them to listen while locking them in your car on a freeway, and also doing Uber driving and forcing your passengers to listen to this episode on repeat until they get angry or pee themselves in fear. Also, keep the algorithm fluffing my show like a porno shoot by leaving reviews, comments, continuing to stream and download, and also liking things I post on YouTube and Twitter, which is mostly just episode announcements, and also on YouTube the episodes get uploaded there automatically. But I do the fireside chats every couple weeks, which is nice. I have another special one on the way with that. You might want to view that. Also, send me in emails and DM me on Twitter to reach out directly. And all of that will keep the dopamine flowing and make me more inspired to keep going strong. And with that, on to the show. Alright, welcome back, everyone. I hope you're ready to join me on Wet Willie's safari adventure. And if you look out your left and right windows, you'll see elves swarming the bus. Don't give them your firstborn, no matter how hard they suck on your fingers. Moving away from whatever the fuck that was, let's discuss what an elf even is. And that's immediately where we get into some territory stickier than Wet Willie's safari adventure, because there's a lot of branching paths to what elves are. I mean, in some settings, they're tiny little people. They're basically just pixies, but by a different name. In others, they're massively tall, regal entities whose power is outclassed only by how much you want to stick your goo tube in their hog slobber. Or, they're fickle and horrifying creatures from beyond all that is good and holy. But even in these vastly disparate settings, we still have some similarities in elves. Firstly are all their physical characteristics. Elves are usually more beautiful or conventionally attractive than humans, with sharper senses and a lot more perceptive. Basically, their software is just as good as their hardware, and they can also make your wares hard. Elves are also usually portrayed as a lot more androgynous, that have long pointed ears and lack most, if not all, of the human defects or imperfections, with the exception of some of those Victorian-era wasting illnesses for that good old-fashioned tragic maiden arc. And finally, they're usually immortal, or at the very least, incredibly long-lived. And this varies by setting, from being able to live about 700 years, to aging extremely slowly, to not aging at all, to being essentially immortal unless someone actively tries to kill them. Oh, don't worry to you chin strokers that think that sounds familiar, we'll talk about it later. On the mental and spiritual side, elves are pretty wise, smart, have a stronger mind and willpower, whatever that fucking means, and are also usually more technologically or technically advanced than humans, which are different things. Technology is technology, and technical skill is like being able to work with your hands and like have techniques. And all of these usually come hand in hand with arrogance of some kind. Elves love telling you that they're better than you. They're also good with nature and are usually better with magic. And not only are they usually better at magic, the author gives them their own super special form of magic, like those kids at birthday parties that throw a fit if they don't get a gift too. A lot of them can also just innately cast spells, which, depending on the setting, sound like a recipe for disaster. I mean, like, it's not the case in Warhammer Fantasy, but if it was a case in Warhammer Fantasy, that'd be a fucking nightmare. So basically, when you combine all of this together, elves are essentially just human plus. They're better than us in just about every conceivable way. But they look like us. Which I'm going to be honest is total and complete bullshit. I mean, how dare there be any fictional setting where the best boys aren't human? But before we get into subtypes and that weird human supremacy thing, let's get into how elves are usually organized. Usually, they live in tight-knit traditional communities that are organized in a strict but respectful hierarchy or absolute monarchy that also tends to be meritocratic and full of politics. Usually the exact form of meritocracy fits in line with whatever neat little form of elf they are. Like maybe your sun elves are judged for the ability to use light magic, while the moon elves are judged for how many strangers they've shot through the head. Also, their beliefs tend to be based on the magic they can cast in some aspect of the natural world they're closely tied to, which also so happens to be tied to their gods, that also happen to be a lot more real and more involved than any of the other gods. Again, they just fucking had to be better than us. Those little fucks. And on top of all of that, they are also incredibly skilled artists, musicians, and craftsfolk that have rich, complex personal lives and bonds that are incredibly important to their society. Once again, better than us in every way, and yes, I'm jealous, and yes, that's why I hate them with a fiery fucking passion. But what was that thing I said about subtypes? Well, elves in most, if not all fantasy, are divided into subtypes, which serves as one part ethnic group, one part culture group, one part nation, and also one part some elemental bullshit tied to the nature of the world because of fucking course they're tied to the fabric of reality. The three most common are high, dark, and wood elves. High elves, besides not actually being stoned all the time, are credited as being the most civilized, noble, wise, cultured, and honorable. They also have a deep sense of morality and are deeply connected with magic and nature. Additionally, their social structure tends to be organized around individual leaders that have gained their position from a mixture of merit and politics. Oh, and they're usually the rich ones and are incredibly graceful and regal. And most of them can talk to animals. Oh, and they're also usually white and blonde. And to say the other quiet part out loud, yes, they are the most generous interpretation of imperialism. Dark elves, as kind of the evil reflection of high elves, are sinister and malevolent elves that usually take some sort of demented pleasure from or have to torture others. They're generally connected to dark magic, some form of evil or malice, like pissing all over the toilet seat and then putting the seat up to really keep them guessing, death and the underworld, and all sorts of fuckery and buggery. And yes, I mean that in the British sense. On the mild end, they tend to be goth, but in more extreme settings, or grimdark, they can go all the way up to being Dennis Rader, but a Nazi. They also are usually a lot stronger or better in a fight than their cousins. Their hierarchies tend to be based on nepotism, politicking, and good old-fashioned murdering your first cousins. And yes, this is usually the bad side of imperialism turned up to 11, or what the alt-right manosphere fuckknuckles think leftists are, and what leftists think everyone who isn't them is. And if you've listened to Waytat, I'm not an exception. Finally, we have the Wood Elves, who are the hippies of the family. They usually are associated with forests, but you sometimes see them anywhere nature exists. They're usually more nimble, agile, and are able to move through natural terrain fairly easily, either because they've been raised in it or from some kind of magic. They're also good archers. As far as their societies go, they tend to be led by a council of elders, or directly by some natural force, or not at all, or a direct democracy. Basically something that has like a natural-ish kind of nature-y vibe to it. And it's the same with their cultural traits, being as rustic and earthy as elves get, which is to say living in trees but still wearing gold and emeralds that they somehow get without mining. They're usually standoffish and don't like strangers and are more than willing to pincushion you with arrows for trying to sell solar panels or tell them about Mormon Jesus, which is a private property policy I wish I had the balls to enact. Wood elves also tend to be even more magic than the other kinds of elves, with heavy implications that this is how they're supposed to be. But with all that covered, why elves? Why does everyone care? What makes them so special? Why are they so important? The long and short of it is they represent some very common themes in fiction and can play very important roles that imply things about the world without you having to come out and say it or, honestly, really do a lot of effort on it. Such as being protectors in aspects of nature. Think of just those first three subtypes. High elves protect nature by intertwining it with their civilization and removing the dividing line between those concepts entirely. They can represent the parts of nature that are helpful to civilization or the parts of the natural order that we like. Dark elves protect and represent the nasty, violent parts of nature. The things we don't want to think about, the protectors that take it too far, the parts of nature that include exploitation and violence and pain and torture. And wood elves represent the parts of nature that hate civilization and see it as encroaching on their space. They're also the most directly protective. All of this personifies nature in a form that's understandable to your audience without making up something incredibly inhuman, but still having that air of mystery and mystique. But related to that, elves are also an easy way to have a representation for all the things of magical creatures that you can't be fucked to make up that are beyond human comprehension or are beyond our ability to replicate. Like if you have elves that are supremely regal, magically powerful, wise, and beyond human skill in combat, then you can have a little bit of that horror of something way too powerful in a nice and friendly package your audience won't instantly want to set on fire. Unless it's me, but that's because of a personal beef I have with elves. My ex-girlfriend was an elf. Also, this means when elves are out of their environment, then something is really fucked up. Also, I'm kidding. I don't have an ex that's an elf, obviously. They're also commonly used as tragic figures, straight from Tolkien. They're so powerful, long-lived, and beautiful that it's a shame when one dies or has to suffer. Assuming your audience likes them. If they like to watch them suffer, then this is not tragic, it's just fun. By having just a handful of elves living in the ruins of their civilization, you make the insinuation that things used to be much better. People were more powerful, threats bigger, and society better and happier. But now, it's all changed. They can also represent being unwilling or unable to give something up. An inability to compromise, perhaps, or an unwillingness to be wrong. Having something so strong with these failings can imply how far the mighty have fallen or how fucked the world is. And finally, elves are great at the nitty-gritty plot stuff. Because your audience knows vaguely what an elf is, the whole wise, powerful, semi-immortal deal. Meaning that they also get used a lot as plot movers, agents of change, and exposition dumps that your audience can get on board with. Why did this elf have a magical ritual that lets the main character see their birth and how their dad is actually the big bad they've been chasing? Because elves. Why did this elf jump in front of the path and tell the party to get fucked or pound sand right when they're about to get to their objective? Because elves. How in the fuck do they know personal details about this ancient civilization no archaeologist has even been able to find record of? Because elves. All this sounds reasonable, and you get to keep your audience's investment because it matches how they perceive them. But to answer the rest of those questions, let's go to the history. And we begin in the medieval period with the first time that we start to record mythologies and folklore about elves, such as the Alfar of Norse mythology, which were the original toxic queens, being incredibly powerful, beautiful, and magical, but also spreading sickness and misfortune. I don't want to fix her, I want her to break me. And in English and Germanic folklore, elves were mischievous prankster fairies and caused ill fortune. In 1220, the Prose Edda is written and divides the early elves between light and dark, funnily enough, mirroring the seelie and unseelie courts of Irish mythology, which might be some form of cross-contamination or filling in the gaps in Norse myth, since, the Norse were already Christianized with more familiar myths, or it was just how it's supposed to work. I mean, it's kind of hard to tell with anything from the prose or poetic Edda, because it's way past Christianization. Around the same time, many who believe in elves saw them as causing illness, giving bad dreams, replacing children with changelings, and becoming uglier and uglier. However, as the Middle Ages began to progress, elves started to get more helpful and benevolent, at times seen as misunderstood pranksters or even just straight up friendly. Totally unrelated, have nothing to do with the Bedonkers. As the age progresses, elves get tied up in the concept of the seductive nymph, while a lot of their roles get taken over by the idea of fairies. This is not written in the script, but I would also posit that maybe it's because we started to, quote unquote, master nature, that, as we became more advanced, we started taking over more natural places, and so, elves got less scary, so instead we started idealizing them and wanting to stick our dick in them. Anyways, after the Middle Ages, all of this continues to progress, especially the sticking your dick in them part, with parts of England and Scotland associating elves with the Fae in general, as well as being actual creatures that existed. Basically, elves are real and are Fae, but not all Fae are real. You gotta pretend to be a good Christian boy when Jesus is watching, which is all the time. He's a pervert. Jesus, watch me jerk off. Elves also begin to get taller and more humanoid, transforming into something to be desired, and desires humans as well, as being kidnappers, romantic elopers, and also pretty rapey. Yeah. But like all things that are pretty rapey and morally ambiguous, during the 1740s Romantic era, elves get a new lease on life. I was gonna make a joke about some modern YouTuber movie star that's been busted lately for being a fucking rapey pervert, and the last one that came to mind was Harvey Weinstein or Kevin Spacey, and that was years ago. So really fucked up the opportunity to be on time there. Anyways, in the 1740s, the elves were picked up as a curiosity by the elite. Here, they're used in a large number of folk songs, plays, and art as romantic figures, and also brooding, mysterious villains and anti-heroes, or even narrators. This also inspires waves of interest in older works revolving around elves, including Midsummer's Night Dream. However, not everything is nearly as pro-elf. Like the 1782 The Earl King, or the Elf King, where it tells of an elven king of the Fae within the Black Forest that lure children to their death. Or just straight up fucking kidnaps them from their village. And the first time that elves are associated with Christmas would be 1823, where in the poem A Visit from St. Nicholas, aka The Night Before Christmas, where Santa is described as an elf with diminutive elven helpers. Which to me almost sounds like a Dom Bear with his harem of short king twinks. But hey, that's just me. Now, this is also really going to be the only time that we talk about Christmas elves, because this is the only time where they're really relevant to this discussion. Christmas elves are like a branch of the family tree that we don't really need to get into, and they're kind of like the embarrassment of the family. Unless you want to include them in your fiction, but I mean, hey, that's your story, your funeral. And then finally, we get to the modern fantasy elves and Lord Dunsea's The King of Elfland's Daughter, where the Princess of Elfland, Lyrazel, marries a man named Alveric and has a son named Orion. And this is what combines the traditional view of elves with a more modern interpretation of them. But we don't get the actual modern elf until 1954, when Tolkien created his elves that changed the face of fantasy forever. And he based them largely on the Alfar, and to appear to be semi-divine beings that were incredibly brave, graceful, wise, and beautiful, with extraordinary powers beyond what any human is capable of. And they're immortal, not because it's a blessing, but because it's a curse. See, in this setting, God gave humans the ability to die of old age as a way to be free and join him in heaven. Something that elves can't do. The closest they can do is go into the West. Wild, huh? Anyways, a bunch of nerds have since used this model, including Moorcock, Robert E. Howard, Paul Anderson, and many others. Also, a lot of them were coming up with ideas of the elves, like around the same time, but uh, like they all kind of got to the same conclusion. And all of these creators collectively inspired D&D in 1974, which gave us elves as a playable race from essentially the very birth of role-playing games. They also inspired Warhammer Fantasy in 1983, which was built on all of these authors' work and also the back of European history. And this would go on to inspire fantasy miniature wargaming for decades, even to now, with basically every wargame inspired by or designed opposite of Warhammer Fantasy Battles, which I'm sure the Games Workshop is having a fucking conniption about. And since then, how we've gone about elves hasn't changed a whole lot. So let's talk about that in the current. Alright, so what's up with elves? Why do we use them? Well, let's first acknowledge something. As much as us nerds claim that we want something unique and different every time, let's be real, we don't. We want something that scratches that itch in the back of our brain from the first time we got into fantasy. Like, I love the Lord of the Rings movies' battle scenes, and Warhammer Fantasy captures that for me. I also love D&D and the D&D squad-based war games I used to play, so anything that scratches that itch is also super attractive to me. And as much as I've talked shit on elves, they're part of that. So let's just keep in mind that a big reason why elves are so common is because elves are kind of like a fantasy staple, and a lot of people need to feel at home. But beyond that, what's some other big reasons why people use them? Well, I mean, a lot of these have to do with reducing legwork. So, firstly, with them being wise, ancient, and possessing ancient power and knowledge. Because we're all nerds and know that elves are usually pretty old and smart, it's easy to just slap them in when we need someone to talk about some old shit and the players to believe that's true. Or, at the very least, to trust that this person is telling the truth. Secondly, they can provide a unique view and insight into the world while still being similar enough to humans to still make it relatable. And since they aren't human, you can get away from binding them to a real world human culture. To our human ones, just kind of out of habit. But by making them elves, then we break ourselves to that mindset and get to make something ahistorical. Well, kinda. It's at least not going to be obviously historical. We still usually end up doing it anyways, but just as like a remix of different traits. Weirdly enough, usually like Japanese elements and like Middle Eastern elements, and then like English for some reason. Third, elves are both a powerful ally and a serious threat. When you're making a wargame or RPG, you often want your big factions to bring a sense of, oh shit, or oh shit, when they show up. And with all the baggage that elves bring, you can pretty easily do that. If in your wargame you want a powerhouse Deuteragonist faction that aren't stunties like dwarves, they're made up of heavily armored badasses, and not a horde of faceless schooners to show up and save the day, elves are a good choice by default. Or if your players have been doing an investigation and find out that an empire is planning to invade, what's more threatening? The Elven Empire or fantasy Romans? Exactly. And my history nerds can tell you how scary a Roman invasion is. But finally, elves are often used as a source of tension and conflict, but also a release of tension and conflict. Sometimes both in the same story, sometimes right next to each other. Like, for example, let's say your characters have their back to the wall and the BBEG is forcing them to retreat. So they run into the elven forest and try to hide there, only to be found by the elves. Seeing as they're big-tittied elf rangers from a different elven tribe, they of course have to go to trial because by being here she's breaking a 10,000 year peace treaty. Also, her friend's trespassing, meaning they're going to die unless she declares otherwise, probably by marrying one or all of them. But first, I need to decide if she's a person or not. See, they're breeding conflict. Also causing characters to breed. We don't have time for this, and also your shonen-ass hero is going to get his dick in a twist over her safety for totally not boner-related reasons. But the trial goes well. So well, in fact, that the elves decide to help the party by going to war. Awesome. And better yet, all of this is believable because 1, these aren't humans, so they get to be weird, and 2, because they're elves, and elves are smarter than you, so they know what's best, and they probably don't care to explain. And for some reason, this is what's best. But you might have noticed that none of this even necessarily needs elves. You can do basically any of those with your own fantasy race. Or hell, dwarves, or copyright-free hobbits, or maybe even goblins, or orcs, or fairies, or whatever fucking weird furry race you make. What's the appeal of elves? Well, let's be honest. They're sexy. They're hot. You can add whatever traits you want to them to make them fuckable, and because they're hot, people love to play them, dress as them, and draw them. Sometimes safe for work even. And the thing is that their beauty and grace means they're appealing from both an artistic and attraction perspective. And because they tend to be so androgynous, you can really change up the sliders to make them attractive for basically any sexual orientation. So they're flexible in that way. Which is what she said. Now, secondly, in most settings, they have unique powers, which is really appealing when people play them in RPGs, but also makes them incredibly appealing for world-building opportunities, since you can really focus on your world's own weirdness through them even easier than you otherwise would. Third, they're deeply connected with mystery, magic, wisdom, and allure, so your audience and players that like those things want to be around elves. And this time, not even necessarily for horny reasons, although also for horny reasons. And finally, elves usually have or imply a deep history, culture, and interesting beliefs, which some people find really appealing. I gotta say, I get it. Kinda. A little. Look, I don't super like elves because they feel very generic and overplayed. I have a lot of other species that need love, but before I get into that, why does this matter? Well, it's time for William's Overthinking Conspiracy Corner. Pull up a chair, it's very cozy. Because while elves can be a lot of fun and represent some pretty awesome things, you still do need to be cautious. And on the softer side, because your audience knows what an elf is, and failing to live up to those expectations can knock them out of the immersion, just like anything else. But the problem with elves is that their traits and tropes are either entirely necessary to maintain the immersion like this, or they need to be replaced. Like, for example, if you have elves in a setting in all the classic fantasy ways, but they live the same amount of time as a human, does that really feel like an elf? Because to me, it doesn't. But it does feel more like elves that their single lifespan is as long as a human's, but they reincarnate with their old memories repressed or locked away in a vault, to be opened when their third eye opens and Taco Bell no longer gives them the sharts. So you need to look at all of these traits and tropes and examine a few things. Are elves right for you? And can you make them actual elves? The harder side, haha, like a penis, is that some of the elf traits and tropes can really start to look like dog whistles when you examine them closer. So, for example, in a lot of settings, elves are kind of put in the position of being the quote-unquote adults in the room, basically meaning that they're the most objective and reasonable ones, at least on a societal level. But they also carry a lot of baggage of their longevity, with things we associate with old people like tradition, knowledge, ancient artifacts and heirlooms, old secrets, prudence, tightly held conservative values that make everyone uncomfortable, and xenophobia. Because think, in most settings, elves have weird opinions on things, and are co-owner. Because think, in most settings, elves have weird opinions on things and are co-owners of the racism factory alongside dwarves. Not only are their cultures usually hegemonic, but they are also pretty routinely say some whack shit about humans, orcs, or whatever furry and or comedic short race you have in your setting for no goddamn reason because they're elves. And when you combine these tropes of usually being right, or at the very least most grown up and mature, with blatant racism, you might get some people reasonably asking if you're saying that's what mature people behave like. Or can make your elves just straight up unlikable pricks that your audience assumes are colonizing pieces of shit when you were trying to make them look like the good guy. Now also, they tend to represent things we associate with the rich, elite, and intellectuals, and depending on your political affiliation and the subtype of elf that you have, deeply conservative or leftist values. You know, like how dark elves are usually portrayed as having a lot of female leadership, BDSM gear, and a decadent but ultimately vapid and empty life. Yeah, sometimes that's talking shit on leftists, and sometimes that's talking shit on capitalism. Isn't literature fun? But regardless, you should be aware of those connections so you can choose to enforce them instead of your audience filling gaps for you, or choose not to, and then accidentally saying something you don't believe. Like if the high elves in your setting are incredibly sexist in all the modern American ways, have a government that's almost but not quite fascist, and their ruling class are a bunch of stuck-up nepo babies, and they're meant to be the good guys while clearly being an underhanded attack on conservative politics, you're kind of implying that all of that is good actually, and we should do it more often. Which leads to the last one, the big, invisible white elephant in the room. Wait. The semi-visible, the white, look, it's a skin color. Elves are almost always pasty and pale, and when they aren't, they're the rapey cave Vikings that are pitch black. Yeah, we aren't really being very subtle here, are we? While I haven't seen it explicitly drawn, after doing this research, I gotta say, it is a little uncomfy to see how easily the line could be drawn of these highly intelligent, beautiful, graceful, rich, long-lived, highly advanced, intellectual, imperialist, mature superhumans, Ubermensch if you will, with Celtic, Norse, and Germanic roots, being maybe kind of racist. Or at the very least, easily co-opted by hate groups, like the myths that they're inspired from. If you aren't at least a little aware of this potential line and aren't paying attention, then you might accidentally do a racism that could go unnoticed until someone hyper aware of it, like a fuckheaded podcaster or someone experiencing actual racism and racial trauma, sees it and makes some bold but not wild assumptions about if you do or don't attend Ghost Club. Although this one is fixed by having your elves be a lot of different skin colors, so just do that, you fucking freak. But for more sounding advice like that, let's go to the application section. Alright, so let's talk about how to use these fuckers. Besides roughly, if they consent. And really, rather than going into specific advice, we're going to use this segment to remind you to do something you should have been doing anyways. Think about your story. Because while the exact role you want them to play in your story will obviously be different compared to other stories, and those uses deserve their own episodes, the place that you should probably be considering for elves is the traits that elves are really known for. So let's go over their longevity, connection to nature and the natural world, their grace and beauty, and finally their intelligence. Beginning with longevity. In a lot of settings, elves tend to live around 500 to infinity years. But let's just go with the 500 years for the made-up elves that we're making for literally this episode that will never be mentioned again. So here's some things to think about with that five. So here's some things to think about with that. 500 years is 5 entire human lifespans on the generous end. 5 entire cycles of humanity, 5 generations of a family. Which, again, that's pressing your luck a little bit. For context, 1524, 500 years ago, as of this date, Hernan Cortez was doing his Hernan Cortez thing across South America. And if an elf was born on that day, they would have just now be reaching the end of their natural life. I want you to think about that kind of I want you to think about what that kind of perspective does to you. They'd have seen an entire half of the world discovered, colonized, revolutionized, and on the verge of late-stage capitalist collapse throughout one of their lifetimes. And think, what kind of perception of time would they have? Do they remember their first 100 years? Will you remember what you were doing at 20 when you're 100? Do you, assuming you were 30, remember what you were doing at 6? Beyond vague recollections and family stories? And if you do remember it all, or at least a lot of the details, how are you not fucking miserable? I've heard people with photographic memory fucking remember every time their mom tell them that they were a disappointment. Every heartbreak is almost painfully fresh. If you live that long and have that many memories, do moment-to-moment things even matter to you? I mean, what do you care about? I mean, think, for context, a human lifespan, in comparison to the average lifespan of a cat, is about 5 times. The same as a human and elf, for our example. The longevity is a big deal that you should really think about, because it might just explain why they're such a stuck-up piece of shit. It's not because they don't love you, it's because they love you in the same way that you love a cat. Secondly is that connection to nature. What exactly is the details of that? In what way are they good? In what way are they connected to the natural world? Are they nature spirits, or are elves just really good with plants and animals? Do they live in the natural world and are highly adapted to surviving in any climate? Or are they so attuned to nature because the natural world is their homeland, in their homeland is really docile and good to them? And what interpretation of nature? Because, for example, if they're nature how it actually is, then they're fucking assholes. Because nature isn't kind. Beautiful, yes, but not kind. Are they idealized nature, or are they nature in a more spiritual sense? Answering these questions will make it a lot more clear to your audience not only the nature of the world, but also give you a general vibe of the elves and how they act and what their culture's like. Like, if they're just good with plants and animals, and they are really good at living basically anywhere, like a really fuckable cockroach, and are a bunch of absolute assholes, then you're telling us that nature is almost like its own entity that is right now being represented by the elves, and also telling us that elves are not a fucking joke and are really dangerous. Now with the grace and beauty. Is this in a sexy way? Are your elves big titty goth mommies and glass cutting chin having chads? Do they have no gag reflex and long tongues? Or are they graceful and beautiful in the classical way, being very visually appealing with some implied delicateness? Or maybe they're graceful in the gymnastic sense and beautiful in the same way that a forest is beautiful, because it's something grand and impressive. Or hell, maybe it's all of them. And what exactly do these interpretations do? Well, assuming that your story's not telling something assuming that you're not telling something really grim, dark, and gross, the first one would kind of imply that elves are everyone's waifu slash husbandos, and might have some kind of ancient blessing. But also, sexy by whose standard? Or is it the kind of thing like there's an elf for everyone? Or multiple elves? Is there a culture of elves that are tall, dominant women with strong facial features and cheese grater abs that I'm interested in for research purposes only? Or is it just stuff that makes you hard? If it's the second one, are they actually delicate? What does this appearance mean for them in the wider world? And for the third one, which sounds both badass and terrifying as fuck, how does this manifest? Do they do a bunch of flip kicks in battle? Or they just use ancient magics beyond human comprehension, and then when they're at home, they hang out in a totally not sex swing? And finally, the intellectualism. Why are they smart? Finally, the intellectualism. In what ways are they smart? Why? What does it do to a society to have a bunch of people with IQs above 150 walking around? Also, don't just make a society of Sheldon Coopers. That's the autism, not the intellect. Intelligent people are just as likely to be irrational and emotional as everyone else. Trust me, I'm one of the most irrationally emotional people that I know, but I'm also the only one in my immediate circle with a college degree, 2 research-heavy podcasts, and a deep understanding of my own psychology. If society was set up with a bunch of me's, we'd be even more fucked than we already are. How advanced are your elves? Are they simply excellent artists and craftspeople? Or are they the most advanced scholars in the world on the verge of discovering electricity? Do they use their intelligence for interpersonal things? Like, are they some of the best lawyers, diplomats, and con men in the world? Keep all of that in mind when you think about your elves. Also, keep in mind, smart people can be dumb. Because while I did stroke my own dick there, I'm also fucking awful at everything that's not my wheelhouse because I straight up refuse to think about anything longer than 10 seconds, and it makes me a dumbass. As a personal flaw, and trust me, I know I need to work on it. Am I going to? Probably not. Onto the soapbox. Man, fuck elves. I'm a hater, 100%. Nah, I've kind of been playing a character myself. Elves are fine. They're just really overused. I mean, trust me, that's coming from a man that's overused elves in basically every fantasy setting I've ever made. There's always at least 3 cultures, and they always have the coolest lore and have all my wildest leftist ideals combined with some of the worst possible attitudes towards life you've ever seen, and yes, it's a projection. The problem really I have with them is how much they're put on a pedestal. Elves are treated like the most unique and crazy, cool fantasy concept, and like it's a requirement for a fantasy setting. But really, they're just humans with pointy ears, and not even used in an inspired way most of the time. This is kind of slapped in without much thought. But that's not to say that it can't be done well. It can. Elves have a lot of potential, and a lot of early stuff done with them felt really inspired, and some of the things they're still used for I find really cool and interesting. But again, from my view, they're kind of just like normal people with pointy ears. And I want to like them, but I just cannot bring myself most of the time. Maybe it's a inner contrarian, or maybe because no one's done something interesting with them consistently in a few decades. Except Super Quest Saga. Their elves are fucking fantastic, and you should watch that. Anyways, let's get you out of here. Yeah, I know. Really milquetoast opinion there. What do you expect from me? A fucking dissertation on elves? Anyway, don't forget to subscribe to this podcast feed, like it, leave a review, whatever else it is you can do on your platform of choice. Send me an email at waytappods@gmail.com with questions, concerns, opinions, compliments, insults, actuallys, your favorite elven culture, your elf waifus, and those silly little number codes people keep telling me about, and anything else you want to tell me. Also, follow me on Twitter at waytat_pods. Remember to check out my other podcast, Waytat. Sometimes as spicy as this, sometimes more. Alright, have a good night, have fun, keep writing, and remember, elves don't deserve your tip. And remember, elves don't deserve your tip. Keep your head up, King. This has been Why You're Talking About This Nerd. I've been your host, William. Good night.